The morning had the false calm of a photograph, the lawn cut to military precision, the light soft through the oak leaves, the house itself humming with the private hush of grief. Seth Jordan's suit hung on him like a uniform he'd never wanted to wear again. Black, heavy, folded into the same movements his son used to tease him about. He was finishing a mirror check when the neighbor came running across the yard, breath loud as an alarm. "Don't start the engine." The words fell like a hammer. Garrett's bathrobe flapped in the wind. He was an ex-cop who had settled into suburbia with a watchful silence. When he spoke, you listened. He told Seth what he'd seen at 11:30 the night before a BMW pulled up, a figure moving under the hood, furtive hands working with tools. He'd watched through the bedroom window until the intruder slammed the hood and fled. "It was Helen," he said. The name was a stone that sank through the garage floor. Seth had the distance and detachment of every engineer he'd ever known. A habit of reducing panic to variables. Brake lines, steering rods, a slow fail designed to look like fate, professional, precise, meant to kill without leaving the obvious fingerprints of malice. The possibility slid across him like ice. His son had died only weeks before. The will reading would be today. The estate, Martin's life's work, lay somewhere between those two events, and an inheritance of 40 million became a motive sharp enough to cut. Waiting for the mechanic on the concrete, Seth felt the old rhythm of memory. Martin teaching him how to solder a circuit board in the basement, the smell of coffee during late nights of work, the boy who'd become a man obsessed with protecting others from invisible threats. "Dad, if something happens to me, be careful with Helen," Martin had once texted. He'd dismissed it as the noise of a man sick on morphine. But Garrett's bone, deep certainty, the way his voice trembled when he said he'd seen her hands on Seth's car, made every casual dismissal crumble. Tom Riley arrived like a professional ambulance, toolbox and Irish accent filling the modest garage with pragmatic light. He lifted the car and the world shrunk. Metal, rubber, the undersurface of a life that had quietly betrayed. Where rust and road wear form ragged honest signatures, Tom found surgical lines, clean and deliberate, placed with a knowledge of how a car yields at speed. "This wasn't random," he said. "Someone wanted failure, not a scratch." Seth's heart did something he hadn't felt since his son's last breath. It tightened with protective fury. The plan he had for the morning, the neat protocol of grief and legal reading, split in two. One track led to a law firm where paper would decide fates. The other steered him into a darker geometry, evidence, proof, an exposure that would make murder a public thing. He did not yet know how deep the rot ran, only that the morning's hush had been broken by a warning that might have saved him. He slid his keys back into his pocket and walked away from the car, toward the choice that would name his enemy. Tom's flashlight cut a hard, meticulous path across the car's underbelly. It threw metal into high relief, unkind angles, scars that spoke an industry language. Brake lines were grouped like nerves, ties and hoses were arranged for function, not design. Tom's hands moved with the memory of decades of work. He pointed and Seth saw the pattern. The cuts were clean, the sort of incision made by tools with purpose, not by fluke. Tie rod threads loosened like a subtle sabotage. "This was meant to fail after a long run," Tom said. "It would look like an accident once you were already on the highway." The realization landed cold, death staged as misfortune. A mechanic's certainty is a peculiar thing, neither dramatic nor sentimental. It is a fact with the slow curve of proof. It becomes a story only when someone takes the pictures, writes the notes, and signs the report. Tom took photos, measured distances, documented what a jury would later watch on a screen. While he worked, Seth's mind stitched memories and alerts into a new map: Martin's phone message, the unusual doctors, the strange private consultations Helen had arranged, and the way she'd spoken in rooms full of people with a performance that looked practiced rather than pained. There were other signs that needed collecting, and Seth became a man possessed of small, methodical plans. He cataloged medical reports, forced himself to read clinical notes looking for pattern rather than pity. The timeline refused to be gentle complaints of fatigue, a sudden, accelerating decline, and treatments that read more like experiments than care. One doctor had been absent, another with glossy credentials appeared like a paid prop. The sequence had logic to it, not the logic of cure, but of concealment. Garrett's off. The record camera systems delivered the next piece: a neighbor's night vision, a frame with headlights and the silhouette of a woman moving under Seth's hood at 11:47 p.m., tools in hand, furtive hunched posture. Helen's BMW was visible on the street, engine still warm. Evidence that reads like a montage in a film. A timestamp, a face in motion, a tool clinking. is lethal when paired with motive. Then there was the medicine that does its worst slowly. Dr. Sarah Williams, an expert in toxicology, taught Seth to read symptoms like a code subtle digestive complaints, progressive organ stress, signs that point to heavy metals or poisons that accumulate. This reads like arsenic or something similar, she said quietly. A gradual accumulation that finally outpaces the body's repair. Hearing the technical words felt like reading a verdict written in Latin. The grief returned in a new form, edged with fury and the clinical chill of responsibility. As the evidence stack built, something else happened. The legal mind woke. Edward Reynolds, the older attorney with the mall of courtroom calm, began seeing the mosaic. He traced paper trails, witness lists, notarizations, and the sealed envelope with Martin's handwriting. A message that cut through doubt. "Dad, be careful with Helen." A testator's voice across the grave had become the pivot on which the entire case would turn. That voice preserved intention and named risk. The evidence was not yet a spectacle. It was a series of deliberate, small, devastating certainties. Photographs, lab reports, dates and receipts. A recorded silhouette that when strung together looked less like coincidence and more like plan. Seth felt the shift inside him, grief bending into purpose. He realized that to protect his son's life and memory he would have to drag something ugly into a world that liked tidy ends. Making proof public would be ugly and painful. But it was also the only route to stopping the next staged accident. He closed the folder of photographs with a hand that did not shake. The law firm's lobby smelled of lemon polish and quiet authority. High ceilings and a wall of glass turned the city into a benign jury. Helen sat like a portrait of everything Seth had grown to suspect. Immaculate in a black dress, hands folded, a magazine folded unused in her lap. Her composure seemed engineered posture, makeup. The precise soft edge of grief she showed on cue. Seth felt the old sting of a father who hadn't been allowed into the last rooms of his son's life. The will reading was supposed to be a closure, not a battlefield. When the lawyer read the document, the room performed its ritual. Signatures, legal cadences, the muffled shuffle of papers. Then a sentence landed that made the air lighter and heavier at once. Martin had left his entire estate to his father. A sealed addendum was opened and a loop of handwriting unfurled beneath Seth's fingers. Martin's words were small and careful, a son speaking to an older man he'd loved and feared would be left alone. "Dad, be careful with Helen. I believe she may try to harm you." Those words were intimacy and indictment at once. Helen's color left her face and then returned in something rawer rage. Her smile broke. She lunged at the documents, fingers raking, voice rising. Where she had been a glossy, controlled figure, she became a force of exposed fury. Papers tore, heels clicked like punitive punctuation. It was the moment when the private, surgical evil, the break lines, the doctor's odd schedule, the payment trail, forced itself into public theater. People swiveled, whispers pushed through the room like wind. Seth kept his voice level because there is power in stillness. He named what Garrett and Tom had found, and he named the message he had found in Martin's handwriting. The lawyer's training kept the scene from tipping into chaos. He called security, kept the originals safe, and documented everything. Helen accused them of forgery and raised spousal rights like a shield. Her legal team, no doubt rehearsed, reached for delays and counters. But the combined weight of forensic photography, toxicology suggestions, and surveillance footage made the shield porous. There is a particular humiliation in seeing a schemer unmask themselves with their own hands. Helen's rage turned frantic. She tore at documents, spat threats, promised ruin by legal attrition. But the more she shouted, the less her entitlement sounded like grief and the more it sounded like a confession through noise. Security guided her out. The office hummed back to its professional stillness, as though a storm had been scrubbed from the glass. Seth felt something close to relief and also an ache like a new wound. The will had given him what Martin wanted, but it had also put him in the position of prosecuting the person who had loved his son at the end, or pretended to. The moral weight of that task made the victory incomplete. He wasn't gloating. He was gathering himself for the work ahead, the papers, the testimonies, the court. He had to turn personal proof into public cause. Outside, cameras gathered and recorded faces and moments, and the first headlines would soon populate phones. Evidence is a choreography. You have to know which piece to lead with so the rest becomes a dance, and Edward Reynolds had practiced that choreography for 3 decades. They began assembling the compact elements that make a jury sit up: the mechanics' technical photos showing intentional cuts, the time-stamped security frames of Helen's BMW at 11:47 p.m., the credit card statements that outlined a pattern of extravagant living, and the toxicologist's careful notes suggesting arsenic-like accumulation. Each piece was small together. They made an argument as unambiguous as an autopsy. Seth's study became a war room, manila folders, legal pads, a whiteboard where timelines were drawn like battle plans. Marcus Chen, the private investigator, moved through that room like an old reporter assembling a story. He had little patience for melodrama. He collected receipts, deposit slips, subscriptions, a credit threshold that betrayed a lifestyle funded by borrowed money. She wasn't just careless, Marcus said. She was banking on permanence. The word permanence, a life paid for by expectation rather than labor, had the coldness of an accounting ledger and the cruelty of a plan. Dr. Sarah Williams sat across the table and explained the clinical pattern with an even voice that made each sentence heavier. This is cumulative exposure. Symptoms present like gastrointestinal stress and then escalate to organ failure. If someone was dosing him gradually, clinically it looks like a disease. Her language was scientific, but the implication felt moral. Murder dressed as medical tragedy. Seth thought about all the times he'd visited Martin in those final weeks, the small rules Helen had enforced, the doctors she had chosen. He remembered the way Martin's eyes had looked sometimes, tired and cold, like someone holding on with a mind that was folding inward. Tom's mechanics file had become the crown jewel. The cuts were precise, located to fail after a specific number of miles. The technique looked professional, not a hobbyist's work. That implied either a hired hand or a planner with mechanical knowledge. Either picture made the crime feel more controlled and colder. Putting that assembly into a prosecutable form required calm, patience, and strategy. Edward coordinated interviews, prepped witnesses, and wrote a narrative that would translate forensic detail into human terms a jury could feel. He drafted a subpoena for Helen's financials, asked for surveillance from adjacent properties, and negotiated with the DA for early review. Every document had to be authenticated. Every testimony had to be framed to show both motive and opportunity. Seth found himself learning to be precise in grief. Where he had once allowed memory to cloud, he now worked to keep everything exact: dates, times, small phrases from Martin's messages. The father in him wanted retribution. The man in him, the engineer, wanted process. He clung to both because justice would need both fire and form. At night, when files were stacked and the room dimmed, he would sometimes read Martin's short, loving texts until the house felt less empty. It was the only strategy to keep himself human in a war that required clinical discipline. Courtroom mornings are made of small rituals: the clicking of briefcases, the hush of bodies rearranging in upholstered seats, the rustle of paper as a case is laid out piece by piece. The prosecution unfolded like a machine built to turn disparate facts into a single, devastating narrative. The DA began with motive, credit card ledgers, and the entitlement of someone who'd long been waiting for an inheritance. Then he moved to means: Tom's forensic work on the car, Dr. Williams's toxicology patterns, the surveillance frames that placed Helen at the scene. Each witness added a little pressure until Helen's story could no longer hold. Helen's defense tried the expected angles: question the notarization, cast doubt on chain of custody, argue that symptoms are consistent with natural disease. They invoked spousal rights and human frailty. But the prosecution had rehearsed each crack and had evidence for every counter. Tom testified with the simplicity of a man who repairs facts for a living. His diagrams made electricians and engineers in the courtroom nod. Dr. Williams explained heavy metal accumulation in plain language, and the surveillance technician matched the frames to timestamps. Then came Martin's handwriting. The sealed addendum read aloud in a room that went quieter than a church. The personal message was brief, but its authenticity removed a final cloak of doubt. A son had seen danger and had acted in the only way a man with clarity could, by making his wishes explicit. It was a small human thing in a room of technical testimony, and it landed like a bell. Helen's breakdown in public at the will reading became evidence of consciousness and panic, not of madness. She screamed promises of appeal and delay, but her actions had been documented and corroborated. The jury saw a pattern: access, motive, opportunity, and the technical ability or arrangement to carry out the plan. The verdict arrived like a punctuation mark to the entire long sentence of grief: guilty. In the press, Helen became shorthand for an old, ugly fable dressed in modern luxuries, greed run through a legal sieve. For Seth, the verdict was both release and new responsibility. Sitting outside the courthouse, under the harsh lens of cameras and microphones, he felt the public's hunger for a simple ending. He provided it with few words: justice has prevailed. But inside, victory felt incomplete because nothing could retrieve Martin. The court could punish the living, but it could not reanimate the lost. The sentencing read like a ritual of closure. 15 years, a long number that would not equal a son, but that would put distance between Helen and other potential victims. With the courtroom behind him and the legal machinery engaged, Seth turned the estate into the thing his son had been, a force for protection. The Jordan Cancer Research Foundation took shape not as triumphal monument but as a deliberate instrument. Grants, targeted research funds, and patient-centered programs that would prioritize treatments and quick trials. At the ground-breaking, Seth spoke with the kind of softness only grief and gratitude can teach. The press framed it as poetic justice. A fortune amassed for greed returned to life-saving work. The foundation work gave Seth a daily rhythm that was different from the court files. He visited labs, spoke to researchers in the soft tones of someone finally authorized to ask questions that matter. He sat with patient families in community rooms, holding hands and listening to stories that made the law feel smaller and the life it protected huge. Martin's vision, using tech and tenacity to protect others, reframed the inheritance from a prize into a promise. Even on quieter days, Seth kept certain rituals. He would sometimes walk the block where Garrett's house stood and feel new gratitude in the neighbor's steady presence. He finally learned the cadence of a community that had watched things unravel and stayed. Tom came by with a cup of coffee and a grin that no courtroom could alter. Marcus and Edward remained the unlikely constellations in Seth's new orbit. There were still moments when the old loneliness rose. A chair set empty at holiday tables, a voice that didn't answer a late call. But those aches shifted into a different shape when he stood at the Foundation's lab and watched a young researcher set up experiments that might one day become treatment protocols. The money had once been motive for murder, now it was scaffolding for hope. Years later, visiting Martin's grave, Seth pressed a folded copy of the first research brief into the granite base and whispered, "We did it." The words were private but not lonely. Michael's warning, his last human act, had not been in vain. In the quiet aftermath, justice had been served, a life was memorialized, and a father had found a new reason to wake up. The arc of revenge had been short and sharp. The arc of rebuilding would be longer, patient work devoured by time and science. In that patient work, Seth discovered meaning. The kind that doesn't erase pain but makes it useful.